Doing good.
All right, streaming started. As usual, um, meetings recorded being live streamed. CNCF, Tech Security, Code of Conduct, blah, blah, blah.
All right, I shared the link to the first node stock, the regular node stock. If people want to record attendance. I can never figure out how to do the return where it adds bullet lists instead of like normally if you hit return twice, it just stops the bulleted list. The shift return always keep going with the bullets. But I don't know.
I feel like it's anytime you're on an empty bullet, if you hit return, it undoes it. But if you're on the previous line, that's not empty, it'll keep adding another bullet.
All right. Is there anything else for the agenda today besides the working session? I don't know, Michael, if you had the chat with the CubeScape folks, how that went.
Yeah, that went well. So we're looking at probably coordinating that with a few of the other open GitHub issues. Let me see if I can find those again. Hold on one second. Let me bring this because a few folks have been talking about like so most likely there's kind of like a hierarchy a little bit, and I'll explain that quickly. Give me 1 second to just sort by recently updated. Where is this thing? Okay. Yeah, so there's ticket number 155, which I'll post in the meeting notes in a second. And at the bottom of that is essentially just things that folks have been asking for, and this is including the CubeScape folks, is one is potentially something like a self-assessment for supply chain security best practices with guidance on how to hit the requirements, right? So that's stuff like, I know that Justin Kapos and some other folks are working on some of the assessment stuff, but hey, could we add in some additional supply chain security stuff there? Another thing is, hey, could that also be potentially automated, right? Like a lot of the things that are actually being discussed in some of the like best practices for projects in the CNCF are also things that Scorecard just automatically does. And could we just recommend something like Scorecard? That's something that is being discussed as well. And then finally, is there, this is sort of the thing that we probably don't want to do too much except in critical circumstances, is like something like a program to help provide security to certain CNCF projects, like things where, this is stuff like, hey, it's a Kubernetes style project of like, it's an enormous thing that is critical to the health of the rest of the CNCF. Money gets thrown at that sort of project and there's lots of scrutiny against it. So I think that's kind of where we're starting to lean. And so there's going to be some additional discussion over the coming weeks. I believe they're sort of looking at the supply chain best practices as well as the secure software factory reference architecture, and just sort of saying, hey, what sorts of things are they like? Do they have open questions? Are there things that they're not do they not understand? And then from my end, I'm also just kind of coming back with a handful of like just high level guidance of just, hey, looking at this assessment, you can see that these are the most important things. These practices are probably a little bit less important, and so on. And I think actually it's going to be tied into some of what we're working on in this group. My thing is mostly just like at a very high level, just sort of saying, hey, if you're a project, obviously following this criteria seems to be the most important, this a little less important. Oh yeah, if you're like fantastic, you should have reproducible builds, all the things, yada yada. But like this should help you get started. And so that's kind of where we got to.
Sorry, I'm late.
For folks who are joining late, feel free to. But yeah, that's it for me.
Cool. It's always more complicated than it seems at first. Everything's connected. The other thing I just put in here, the KubeCon EU Security Village. One of the things that came up in the chat earlier this week about that was finalizing the content and also trying to get a sense of who will actually be there to help out staffing the security village and supporting it in any way possible. So take a look at the GitHub issue. There's a form that I think is going to Marina if you're interested or available to help out. I'm super excited. It's going to be so much fun.
Yeah, I can post that in the chat.
Awesome. Thanks.
Yeah,
okay,
I think it would be helpful to post that in the mailing list as well. Right.
Yes, I'll do that. I'm going to send that and the CFP to the mailing list today.
Awesome. Thank you.
And then without further ado, unless anybody has anything else, we can jump into the second note stock for the supply chain policy. And just I'll share this link too in the chat. And I think we had a lot of really good conversation last week. And one of the things that I was thinking about here of if we kind of look at our overall kind of checklist of things to work through, we still need to kind of formalize or finalize the audience goals and some of the scope. But we were also it felt like there were kind of a couple different levels we're already coming to terms with, which was a more general model for trust as far as the framing to start with, and then the second part was more of the actual rubric, and this ties exactly back to what Michael was talking about earlier, which was can we even just do a survey today of what options people have, and how can we start breaking down the policy to different incremental things that we would look at. And so I was wondering how people felt about trying to split up some work in that area and just even try and set up what those areas are this time, and then maybe have different people talk about a survey of those areas for next time as we start looking at the content. So so let me just try and type some of this as well too. I don't know if I'm making any sense or not to folks, especially with no cameras on. So how to
Would having a camera on be helpful to you? No,
Um,
it's a serious question because if you're facilitating this meeting, and if cameras like are useful, so you can figure out like where people need to go. Yeah.
I think conversation is the most useful. As long as people talk, you can be off camera. Those are if you're not going to talk, then you have to come on camera. Yeah, and also using the reactions thing in the Zoom is helpful as well too. But I think the key thing is for me to stop talking so other people can talk. So like how to break down the idea of establishing a supply chain rubric, and I think the rubric, I spell it like the company instead of the. Everybody knows that. The picture that Michael shared last time is super, maybe like a good thing of like, there's policy before dependency management. Let me share my screen too, if that's helpful or not. So this is the picture here from the notes. Like maybe we can break down these different sections of policy and look at what exists today for evaluating those. Like, is there a scorecard that does multiple of these things, that does individual pieces of these things? I've seen stuff like a lot of people now starting the idea of like scorecards for SBOMs. Like what even exists today? Like kind of doing a survey to understand if we were to offer guidance to folks, what can we learn from the existing solutions? Does that sound like it would be useful or helpful to people?
I feel like it may be helpful just kind of like as a possible brainstorming exercise, but at the same time, I think the may also be restrictive if we kind of take a look at what's out there. So I think it could cut both ways. I think what's in mind for that is maybe like just brainstorming like without looking at those, and then if we look at those and then maybe get more ideas.
Are you? I didn't quite get. Can you scroll back to the diagram of yours? Are you trying to present a visual picture, visualize the entire supply chain? Is that what the idea?
I think so. I'm not sure. I think this was a picture from someone on Twitter. The link is underneath. Okay. Isaac Hepworth, maybe. I think the idea is how to, or the main question I'm concerned with is how we break down this broader and larger question around policy into the different constituent pieces. And so this was a nice visualization of some of those different pieces of policy. But back to Brandon's point, like we shouldn't let this restrict us to being the only things that, like the only pieces of policy, if there are other or additional ideas we have.
Another thing I want to bring up is that there's some differences between this picture and the software supply chain factory architecture, specifically in the release management part. So we want to be able to further, I guess, solidify what that bit means. Like, what does it mean to deploy things? Because there's when you speak to people in the SBOM world, for example, they're dealing with SBOMs for things like IoT devices or software that you like, or operating systems like Linux distros, that sort of thing. They're not necessarily dealing with cloud native because that's, well, we don't even know. We're still having discussions about whether that is something that is necessary or not. So we want to, for folks who are not cloud native, we want to further specify what a deployment means. Or at least that's how I think about it, because there's like this bit like about release management, and release management is different for different types of software deployments. And we want to focus on cloud native.
Definitely agree with that.
So, oh, I forgot. Isaac actually shared a couple more pictures. I'll put that in the document here. I think that is also, those two pictures are also helpful.
Okay, so maybe if we do a little bit of this brainstorming and we think of the different areas of policy that we would want to break down, what do folks think of? We just talked about release management, dependency management, just copying things from below, build, source.
Yeah, I mean, I think that hits, like, I'd be interested if folks have a different thinking, but the way that I've always been viewing it is, you know, supply chain security starts with a developer writing code and including dependencies and ends with that thing in production. And so everything, and I recognize that that's a lot of different things, but I think that sort of stuff is relatively segmented there. I'd be curious if there's folks have like different opinions there. Brendan.
Yeah, I think it's like what we have here with dependency release management build source is kind of like maybe the explain a little bit of the life cycle. But I think also in each of these things, there are different dimensions. Like, do I care about known vulnerabilities or known security issues? Do I care about future potential security issues, or just general health and processes and things like that?
So another point that I want to raise is, what is the difference between a policy and a best practice? Because in the past, we wrote that paper on best practices around securing software supply chain. So how are we differentiating a best practice from a policy? Because what I see right now when we are making these, when we are breaking down these policy areas, these kind of map directly to the categorization that we had in that paper. So what is a policy in general?
So, I mean, we're largely taking sort of the industry definitions around it, right? Where like best practices are good things to do, and like it's just sort of generally good things to do, whereas policy is very much dependent on individual organizations' requirements. So, you know, security policy is very much based on stuff like an organization's risk profile and risk tolerance and all that good stuff. So like how they would adopt those best practices and the prioritization would most likely be colored by policy.
And in the secure softwares and in the best practices paper as well, for each of the best practice, we had identified a risk profile as well, right? Whether it is high and moderate, or is it low? So one thing that I would suggest here is that as a team, I think we need to differentiate this thing, right? That, okay, what is the value overall this paper is going to add? Because we need to guide people whether they should go for best practices or they need to look at policy. If they want to assess risk profiles, then they need to go at one paper, right? So I think having that thing is going to clarify that, okay, that definition, what is a secure supply chain policy, and is it applicable only for the cloud native domain, or is it applicable in general as well, and how it differentiates from a best practice. So I think that clarity is eventually needed so that then we can dig in. The other thing is that I was looking at the previous note from February 23rd, right? And there was a talk about checklisting as well. So checklisting comes after best practices generally, right? When you create checklists within an enterprise, you have a policy, you create best practices and guidelines, and then you create a checklist. So again, I think that understanding has to exist that, okay, what we are trying to do, what is the agenda for this paper? At least this is my 2 cents.
I know I keep harping about that, but I think anything that we write abstract, we have to make it useful also for the practitioners, for the enterprises also, right? So I think as part of that, I know you started doing that in the new dimension. You were saying the vulnerability management, that actually goes to the actual implementation of that in the enterprises. How do you roll it out? But I think there's another factor that we may consider adding, and I would really like to see that is the business impact of the vulnerabilities, right? Because the business stakeholders, the decision makers look at things a little differently than the engineers and developers. So maybe we should bring that aspect also in that. Yeah,
because generally, sorry, I just want to point this thing out. So I will agree with Asad here, right? That policies generally, any security policy is directly mapped to a business objective, right? You can basically trace it upwards towards a business objective. That may not be the case with the best practice, right? So again, that might be a differentiation that we create in this paper, right? That, okay, we are going to talk about a security policy and how it can impact an enterprise at a business outcome level, right? So again, I think that's a great point. Again, I think this is something that we need to clarify. In the best practices paper, it was very tangible, and you cannot really map it towards upwards towards a business objective. So I agree with Asad here. Yeah, sorry, somebody wanted to, Frederick, you wanted to, I think, chime in.
Yeah, so going through working with a large organization on defining similar things for policy, one of the problems that we ran into is that if you declare a policy in a large organization, the policy does not differentiate between cloud native versus mainframes versus ASP.NET systems or so on. So if you have a very simple policy like all data at rest must be encrypted, like it's cross-cutting everywhere. And so the question then becomes, from a policy perspective, is there something we could drive it down to that could be cross-cutting so that a large enough organization that has a diverse set of software deployed is able to absorb it? Or does it end up having to be scoped out, where, say, when a system is cloud native, then it must follow these particular practices? But then that leads to the question about what is cloud native? Like, where do we draw the line there? Is it systems that are deployed in the cloud, or is it systems that were designed with the cloud native definition, which I can tell you for sure that while we drive that forward for our own purposes. Many people in many organizations are unaware of the definition's existence, much less are trying to adhere to it. So when we talk about policy, like we have to be really careful. For smaller organizations, it's easier, but for the largest ones, we have to be really careful in terms of how we define this. Otherwise, we'll find that what we pitch to them is not going to be actionable by them.
So I'll go. Frederick, yes, that's a great point. I think I agree with the point overall that when we are talking about policy in general, it is overarching. It's not applicable only for the cloud native domain. It's generally applicable in a wide variety of settings. However, I do see the value of limiting the scope to cloud native in this paper, at least, because for traditional IT environments and traditional settings, we already have a lot of content out there, right? There are already organizations who have figured it out. They have been practicing it for a long time. But within the cloud native domain, what is a policy to secure a supply chain, right? For that, a lot of material may not be out there. A lot of guidance, what could be a possible policy is not out there. So I think this policy paper can help that team to basically take their traditional IT policies and also take this paper and then create something on their own. So yeah, overall, I think that this is a great point, Frederick. But again, if we do not limit the scope of this paper, then we are looking at a very broad set of requirements, and then I think we'll not be able to cover that thing or do a justice to the topic.
I totally agree. We should limit this to cloud native.
Yeah, and
So-
I do think that there is there's some confusion about like what the definition is of, let's say, cloud native, but I think the CNCF has done a pretty good job at, through stuff like the Cartographos working group and some of these other working groups at really sort of constraining that. I mean, if the answer here is like we can't do the paper without getting the other stuff involved, I would sort of vote against doing the paper at all. Though I doubt that that's actually the case. I think we can sort of say, hey, here are the things that are unique to cloud native that you should consider when thinking about policy.
Well,
Yeah.
one.
Oh, go ahead.
Can I respond real quick? Because I think I'm, and understandably so, I think I'm. Sorry, I got cut off. Can you still hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, so I think that perhaps I threw a little bit too much into my comment. The point isn't about what cloud native is or whether the policy, the things that we write should apply only to cloud native. The question here is how, as when you're running a sufficiently large enough organization, how do we help them set up the initial policy? Because if we're going to talk about policy, how do we help them frame it so that the policy can only be for cloud native? So it's not just about, oh, what is cloud native or not, but rather the more important question is how can a policy be framed in such a way that it only binds to cloud native systems in a way that is actionable by these larger organizations? Because otherwise will just be an interesting thing for them to read, and we won't actually gain any real effect.
So I want to just make a kind of more from a logistical standpoint, right? I think that at least like what I've seen in previous these types of discussions, it always like end up having like a lot of bit of scope creep, and we end up wanting to make something that's super useful, but then the extent of that in the context of an open source collaboration doesn't quite work as well. So I just want to open up the option that like what we could do as a scope as well is to say that, look, here's like eventually what we think will be useful. we can break them down into multiple efforts. And as long as we have a path towards that, we can get agreement on like what the overall direction will be, and then we can scope it down to different efforts. And then, what we produce as a first output may not be that useful in terms of direct impact towards practitioners, but it could be useful as a way to get more folks involved in the conversation and to bootstrap future work as well.
So I wonder if it makes sense to go through the secure software supply chain factory and figure out where in that we want to focus on with regards to differences between how traditional, I suppose, on-prem deployments work versus cloud native deployments, or like.
So I'm going to respond to that. I think that, so you're talking about the reference architecture paper, the secure software factory, that's only like one aspect of it.
Well, yeah, exactly. So the thing is that the reason, I think, let me see if I can backtrack here. The reason we are together over here is because the publications that are available are not enough for folks to actually implement controls around their software, because they do not understand, they cannot really figure out like what it is they need to look at when they're evaluating their existing setup.
I think that is a valid concern, but I don't think it's at least in my view, I don't think that's what this work is for. There's the work that Marina's doing in terms of like tooling. How do I convert best practices to kind of like concrete technical implementation? This is more on, so if you remember the presentation that the 3M folks did, right? They're like, how do we take the security best practices and implement it within an organization? And a lot of that is like, how do we influence the organization? I think this is asking the question from the opposite end of how do I motivate management and executives to say that this is a problem and these are the problems that we're solving, and to kind of like, I think what Faisal and Asad and Frederick were saying, right? This is more about making sure that the goals are made known to leadership, so that these become priority, or these become a way that teams can take action on.
So John, you had your hand up.
Yeah, and I'm trying to process what Brandon was just saying. And I think that's really a really important part of what we're trying to talk about. And I like framing these conversations and taking these back to some of the, I call them like big questions we're trying to answer. I've heard two main areas, but it's important to intersect them with what Brandon just said. In the main areas of concern that I've heard are around like how to inherit trust from upstream open source. I hesitate to use the word artifacts, but like open source software. Maybe I'll use software slightly more. Into an organization's supply chain. And then the other is like how to ensure trust in an organization's own supply chain. And I think that this is where we've talked a little bit about this idea of going from a best practice to a checklist to policy. And I don't know if this is accurate or captures the nuance of some of it, but like I think an important part of that is enforcement. And it may be or may not be automated. And if we try to answer these questions, or the top three questions of this, do we end up with something like that? This progression is an answer to those questions, like how we define policy and potential enforcement to respond to those things.
So I think this is missing one thing, which is measurement. And so you start off with best practices, and then you evaluate what you have existing, which is like the place where measurement happens. I don't know whether measurement is something that happens after you go through a checklist or in parallel with the checklist. But I think what's missing is, okay, we already have something right now. How close to the best practices is it? And for that, there's like a list of goals and then, steps to get to those goals. But we don't have that right now. And so when you do have, a list of goals, you can enforce policy around those goals. Okay, I'll put my hand down. A lot of people.
Are you talking about business goals?
So the thing with the goals is that they typically would map to a business goal. Like the higher level business goal is usually like, we want our software supply chain to be secure, so that we are protected from, liability. That's the higher level business goal, as far as like money is concerned. And then when you trickle it.
I like what you just said. Like that's kind of like the kind of statements that I think like we need to like write down.
What, like the higher level business goal?
Yeah. So like whatever you're saying is good. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, so I mean, this is how like C-suite folks and VPs think, right? Like they don't necessarily think about whether something is secure or not. Risk is not something that they have top of mind. What they have top of mind is revenue. And so you have to like there has to be like some level of measurement so that you can provide data saying in the form of like percentages or something like that, saying, okay, we need to fix this because this percentage of our software supply chain is not secure, and that results in so X number of millions of dollars loss in revenue. And in order to, you can't just make a claim that says, you're not doing this, you're going to lose money. C-suite folks are going to come back and say, show me the data. And right now what we're missing is like a way of collecting that data. What data are we collecting?
Yeah. So just will point out one thing, right? I think, Nisha, you're talking about assessments, security assessments, right? They are generally used to measure the current state of an organization in terms of X number of security controls. And then based on that, you basically give the result that, okay, your organization is at this level. And then, because you are talking about actual measurement here, right? Policy in general is a policy that is a high level artifact that the InfoSec management group actually looks at, right? Of course, the C-level person doesn't do this job altogether. They have this strategy team. They look at the policies that, okay, I want to make my cloud native deployment secure. What are the policies that I could adopt? So they will look at that recommendation. And then on the other side, you have these assessment tools where the vendors generally come in and they say, okay, we are going to do an assessment and we are trying to figure out what policy is being implemented, and then the whole flow works. The best practices in the checklist. So I think that's the only point where I will say that I think when we talk about measurement, we are talking about assessments. At least this is my experience.
So Nisha, you had good point, but I was not really talking about the revenue goals and business growth goals. I was thinking more in terms of when the foremost in the minds of CISOs or CIOs of enterprises, they think in terms of mapping the vulnerabilities to the business risks, right? For example, ransomware and all that stuff, right? Because that end up costing money to the. So actually, so I have written an article on that. I'll share it in the Slack and also add the link here. It basically goes down. That's what I had in mind. Like, so what are the 5 or 6 prime concerns, and they are the main business risks, like reputational risk, and things like that, loss of business opportunity and all that. So these are, and how to map these vulnerabilities to those risks, how to have policies around it. I'll share the link to the article.
Yeah, maybe this is like a difference. So I am not a security person. So maybe this is something like that I have maybe this is a way that I'm evaluating it. But I feel like the assessment and the policy are like two sides of the same coin. You measure the level of risk you have, and then you create policy to lower that level of risk. So it's kind of like they're kind of like opposites, almost like a mask. That's generally like, that's how I'm thinking about it. But because I'm not really that familiar with the way that like folks that do risk management like evaluate and make recommendations on implementation or policy, that's so I agree with Faisal and Asad, but it seems like it's just a matter of going through the motions of creating the measurement and creating the policies and seeing how they map.
Frederick?
So when it comes to policies, very likely what's going to end up happening is they're going to look at the NIST SP 800-53 revision 5, which came out in 2020. There's a new section in there that starts with the letters are SR, Sierra Romeo. And the SR controls are specifically about supply chain management. It does not call out software supply chain or hardware explicitly. It's just about supply chain. What it's demanding of organizations to do is to establish first at the very top of policy that requires a SCRM program to be created, for an SCRM team to be created, and for a set of standards and procedures and guidelines that the company must follow in order to, and there's 4 things that they track against. So number 1 is to identify the software. Second one is to trace its usage. The third one is to prove that it's genuine. And the fourth one is to measure the pedigree. And very likely from a policy perspective, like that'll probably be the extent of what you'll see in a large, or in a mature organization is the way I want to phrase it, rather than large. Because they want to keep it high enough level that they can get flexibility and not have to rewrite the policy every time a technology change occurs, but specific enough that they can get something actionable, and then everything else will flow from there. So that's my prediction in terms of how things will end up playing out from a policy perspective.
So I think, and we're down to about 10 minutes on time here as well. Let's see here. I've got to write down what my thoughts are, as with so many people with so many thoughts. And the sorry. I was thinking about the policy enforcement and the automation of that. I think with the manual assessment, this is another thing. It's like maybe we can, I remember now. So with the executive order that came out the other year, there were 2 main actions as a part of that. And one was the action around SBOMs, which we all know and love, right? Everyone should always have an SBOM for everything. And the other one was the action that every piece of software that is sold to the government required a manual attestation from the producer of that software that their development was in compliance with the recommendations for a secure development. And I think that is a good area to think about, at least in terms of like, how can we take these assessments that are point in time and manual and significant effort, and like, how can we try and help organizations move the needle on that to get it to be something that's automated, continuously enforced, and continuously observed, to have less risk on that signature that they put down on their manual attestation saying everyone in my organization is in compliance with secure development practices. That's kind of like at a high level how I'm thinking about some of this. I don't know if that's that matches up or not. Got a slight nod from.
Could I ask like a higher level question? Do you think that creating a measure or creating a rubric is part of this conversation or part of this working group or not?
I have thoughts on that, but John, do you have anything?
I think the most important thing for me is for us to get through this scoping of what we want to do to something that we have a high level of confidence will be valuable. And like Brandon said before, like maybe the immediate or the first thing is not as valuable as the thing we do after that. And so I'll see what Brandon has to say.
I think when it comes to like actual like controls and like things that we have to check, I think that does fall under the controls group. That's where their expertise, and that's where OSCAL comes in as a way to define those things. I don't think we're at a point where we're able to do that yet. Like they've already done, like I think Faisal has mentioned, right? They've done linking to SSDF and things like that. So I think that's kind of more of the working group that will handle the controls and the measurements and things like that. As far as we can, I think I don't think we have we're not at the point yet where we have tangible things that we can say we can measure. I think that's part of the struggle. Is that like we have no way to like measure supply chain security, and I could be ignorant, but I feel like we don't have the tools and we haven't done enough like of the work to be able to say that okay, here are the measures that you can comfortably take. And so like my initial thought is like, well, we need to prod in the right direction, and hopefully like there's research that kind of like goes more into that. And I know there's already like a few efforts around, but I think that has still a bit of ways to go.
Could I reach out to you later to get more information on what those working groups are? I feel like I'm kind of like out of my depth when it comes to like policy and policy enforcement. At least at this point, I am more interested in measurement and data collection.
Yeah, one thing to reiterate as well is policy from an organization versus executable policy that is executed by a policy agent. And I feel like the measurement stuff comes further down in the policy execution, which it's unfortunate there's a clash between the two words. But I do think that if we're looking at policy of an organization, I actually think we're thinking of this a little bit too high level. Like I think that'll resolve itself. I actually think we should focus primarily on what type of guidance can we give to SCRM teams for standards for if you're developing a cloud native system. Like these are the type of things that you can implement in order to drive a comprehensive solution, as opposed to playing at the standards level. The policy level. Though the policy is important, but I think that's going to be way overbroad, and we're going to have a real difficult time making any real impact there beyond pointing at the 800-53 controls or controls in ISO 27000 to get developed over time or similar.
I think we're at 3 minutes left. John, do you have thoughts on next steps?
I'm trying to formulate them as we speak. I think Frederick's last point was good in terms of like we're still struggling a little bit at identifying the right level to be at, and I'm not super concerned with if we call like we can define policy to mean whatever we end up talking about. Like hopefully that's fairly closely aligned with the organizations and it's like valuable and consumable by them. I think the other good points are like how do we balance the best practices moving towards a checklist towards policy, and exactly like if we don't have the checklist, and I think that those are like super maybe they're straightforward, like maybe that's a reasonable place to start with in terms of like if we have a checklist and then can we move to the policy from there.
I think like maybe so what's in my mind and usually what I personally like doing is to have something you can throw tomatoes at. So I know one thought is maybe like encapsulating, and maybe this is something that we can pair on, at least like trying to gather the thoughts and then put it kind of more into like a roadmap, a larger scope roadmap on like the work of the group. And then hopefully we can use that as a way to move the discussion forward next week.
Yeah, I think that sounds good. All right. Well, we're a couple
Thank
seconds
you.
over time. Thank you, everybody. I appreciate the great conversation as always.
Thanks, John.